Welcome, hello, and ni hao. Welcome back to the Beijing Real. It's a beautiful day here in Beijing. We're here in the Hutong, right in the middle of the city, thanks to CIB Studios. Thank you for sponsoring us. It's a really, really beautiful location, and on top of that, we're here with a wonderful guest. This is Theo sitting beside me. Theo is a psychologist and psychotherapist at International SOS Hospital. He has a PhD in analytical psychology and Chinese culture. He's taught at 8 different universities in China, and he has some amazing insights to share with us today. So, Theo, thank you so much for coming.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Sean. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to have a part, in what's going on.
Yeah, we're excited. So, just to kind of give the audience an introduction of yourself, when someone asks you, what do? How do you normally answer that?
Really depends who it is, because if I answer to a Chinese and they say, what do I do? And I say, I'm a psychologist, and they'll go, oh, so you know what I'm thinking? I say, yeah, as soon as you tell me. So I kind of say I'm here working for a medical group. If it's a foreigner, I'll say I'm here doing psychology or psychotherapy, and they go, oh, really? That's cool. So it really depends.
That's a good idea. I do that with the girls a lot, actually, too. I always change up my answer, depending on who it is.
Yeah.
Great. So give us a quick background, because obviously you're not Chinese, and you're probably not from China, but how did you end up in Beijing, and what kind of brought you here, and how has your journey been since getting here?
When I was a young guy in the States, I wanted to leave America, and it just so happened that in 1998, things worked well that I could. My son, who's now in Taiwan, who was 16 at the time, he and I went to Kunming in Yunnan province. And I was there for about 1.5 years, and then went down to Hainan for a couple of years, and then to Zhejiang province, and then to Guangzhou, and then to Dalian, and then into Beijing. So all of those different places, I was doing psychology and either teaching or studying or both. And then last year, I got the opportunity to come into Beijing to work for International SOS in the clinic. So it's been, one of these things that I've had this goal, but it's been a very interesting journey to get there. Not a straight line like somebody going to a Western university and studying and going. Mine has been an unusual way.
Yeah, that's usually how it is in China. And since 98, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's longer than I really anticipated. I don't know how long I actually thought that I would be here, but it's just wonderful opportunities kept presenting themselves. And, the development of China has been so rapid. And as a psychologist, so many changes for me to observe and to kind of participate in. And so that's been a really exciting part of it.
Great, yeah. So since 98, what has been your best day in China, or most memorable or happiest?
I think in 2000, a friend of mine who I knew in Ohio, who kind of inspired me to come into China, he and I took a bus trip from northern Yunnan up into Sichuan province. And we had to get passes at the time to go into the city. And so we were up in the mountains of Sichuan on a bus that had little wooden slats on the floor, and the dust was coming up as we were riding. And this is a big guy, and he was kind of sitting like this.
Yeah.
So that was a really wonderful experience. We met a few people, and were making animal noises on a bus going out of the city, and they were wondering who these foreigners were.
Jeez. So. It's kind of those weird sort of spontaneous adventures that are the best, huh?
Yeah.
And I think for some reason that happens more frequently in China than it does a lot of other places. So.
Yeah. And here there's definitely a lot of places to explore.
Yeah. Very good. So since '98 again, and your time here, what has been your biggest mistake? Do you feel like?
Yeah, as I mentioned, thinking about that, trying to get an understanding of myself. And I think it was in 2000 when I went back to the United States for the first time, looking for some good Chinese noodles in the small city I lived in. Because Kunming has wonderful rice noodles, over-the-bridge rice noodles, guochumishan.
Okay.
And I wanted some noodles. Couldn't find them. So I come back into Hainan, summertime, about 38 degrees, 40 degrees, and I see noodles, and I get the noodles. and my brain isn't working. I'm excited to get noodles, and I take them home and I eat the noodles. And the next day I get a really high fever and get sick. And then my wife makes some ice, and I have an ice pack under my arm, and it looks so good. So I drink it, and it was tap water. So I ended up in the hospital 5 days on really heavy dose of antibiotics.
Yeah.
That wasn't that great.
Yeah,
You know?
I have some stories like that too, actually, which will probably be mentioned at some later dates during this podcast. Because I think for some reason, poop stories, I like to call them poop stories, are definitely the most entertaining. So,
Sure.
But we'll save that for another time.
Scatology, you can go there anytime.
I've made that mistake too, though. So you live and you learn.
Yeah.
All right, so that's a good time. Since '98, you've obviously done a lot. You've learned a lot. Let's just say in the past month, what has been your primary focus? What have you been working on?
A lot of what I've been doing lately is working to do a couple of presentations in the clinic and at different schools on third culture kids. One of the interesting aspects, of course, of being an expat is, just moving from one culture to another. But a whole nother element is for kids who've grown up in second culture or third culture and their own sense of identity. So I've been doing different presentations about that, and I'll be doing a couple of more. So trying to get my mind around what it means to have your identity as a world citizen, not so much as an American or Chinese or British or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so what is the difference? I mean, because, you and I are from America, and obviously there's a lot of people watching this show that are from the Western world, but just anywhere in general, what is the difference between the way someone outside of China thinks psychologically and the way someone inside of China who's been brought up in China thinks? What's the difference there?
I think a really good book that explains it is by a guy named Robert Nesbitt. It's called The Geography of Thought. And he analyzes that from a social psychological point of view. And Chinese would look more at the context of what's happening. So even if they've done studies and they have a fish tank, and they'll identify more with what's going on in the whole scene, whereas Westerner may identify more of what's the individual items. So there's even studies that have been done that shows that Chinese use different structures of their brain when they're doing mathematics.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So the way that they think about things, the more seeing it holistically more than the individual item, because of the language, because of the culture, philosophy, all that kind of stuff.
So that's why Asians are so good at math.
In part, yeah.
Okay. That is kind of a true stereotype.
Yeah.
Wow. And so would you call China a collectivist country? I mean, just sociology and that sort of aspect of the way of thinking. Obviously, it's related to psychology, and you're looking at this big part. Is China collectivist? Or?
I used to think so.
Mm.
And then there's a gentleman from Taiwan, a Chinese social psychologist, who wrote, I think, very persuasively about the term relational. I think China is much more of a relational society where they look at, the relations between you and me, and if another person comes in, how does that change the relationship? Because collectivism implies that, we're all in this together.
Right.
And I really questioned that recently. I mean, I have for many, many years, because as much as they're together, they are together because there's large groupings, but they're not really connected, So relationship is important, much more, I think, than the idea of collectivism.
Yeah, and there's a word in Chinese for relationship, guangxi, I think
Yes.
it is, right?
Yeah.
And how do you explain that to someone who's never been here before, guangxi and the concept of a relationship?
I do it kind of by a story that a young friend of mine has shared many times. And it's, you and I are talking, and I know you, so I'll tell you something about why I'm going to this university. And let's say somebody else comes in, you know them, I don't. I'm going to tell a different story. because I don't know them. I'm not going to set myself out there, perhaps.
Okay.
And then somebody else comes in, and so the dynamic is such that I'm always aware of who's around, what the relationship is between each people, because I don't want to make you look bad,
Right.
especially if there's a available chick here, right?
Yeah.
You may not know she's available, but I
You got to play a good wingman.
Hey, you bet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think to get to certain areas that maybe would be disabled otherwise, you need specific guangxi in order to accomplish certain things. And I think in the Western world it's almost the same, but in China there's more strength kind of behind the concept.
Yeah, I've never been to a meal in the Western world where somebody who is my age, who is with somebody who's a little bit younger, will pick up a lemon and squeeze lemon on my food before she puts lemon on the other person's food to show status.
Right.
So.
Yeah, status is a symbol, and with that concept, status comes face.
Yes.
And face, I had no idea what it meant when I actually first moved here. I've heard of it, but I still have a hard time grasping the concept. So can you explain face and the concept of face?
Well, what I've learned from a lot of my Chinese, and even the phrase, you can kill a man, but don't make him lose face, right?
Mm-hmm.
So losing face is much more important. Shame, humiliation, but it's not just of the individual. It's of the individual and family and such. So of course all of us have done things that we're very embarrassed about. But to the point, I think that if you're in a relationship and face is important for somebody, I've asked many Chinese all over the country, how many of you believe in honesty? How many of you would lie to save face? Right?
Yeah.
So there's no disharmony there. That's just how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certain aspects that you would just have to remember. Don't cause somebody to feel embarrassed or shamed about things.
Yeah, and what are the repercussions if you do?
As a Westerner, it's really different.
Yeah.
Because I understand this, but I don't have to play that card, right? But for many Chinese, I think the consequences are pretty serious. They may lose opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
They may lose the relationship. Yeah. And they may not have many, the things that could happen if they had given somebody face, because you can, give face, you loan face, those kinds of things.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's almost like a currency in that sense.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah.
You want to really give somebody good face because later on you may get something from them, or you set up this guanxi relationship.
Right.
Maybe intentional, but hopefully long term.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good concept. Thanks for that. I'm also thinking that the viewers watching this, a lot of people wonder what censorship is like here. I mean, I know my parents and family and friends just in general in the U.S. have this idea that China doesn't see anything related to the outside world. It's kind of like its own little cave. Things are sort of tailored for the Chinese people to make them think certain things. So how is censorship a part of marketing in China, and how does it affect the way people see the outside world?
Well, I think we have to accept the reality that now with internet and the Great Firewall and the VPNs to go around or over under the Great Firewall, people have access to the information. Mm-hmm. And as I was mentioning when we were talking beforehand, if we know the boundaries, there's a lot of freedom within the boundaries. So there's a lot you can talk about. You can talk about the problems. You can talk about the issues, but you just never question certain fundamentals about what's happening on a larger scale, who's in charge, and that's that issue. But I think the idea of people learning, kind of imbibing, certain things you don't do. Now, to be honest, in the last 2 years, and the universities, they've installed cameras, so they're kind of watching a little bit closer. So what I used to do in my classrooms, I don't know if I could do anymore, because they're changing that aspect of it. So for marketing, we have some of the, you go down to Sanlitun or one of the areas, and you see they've got brand names that you don't see in the West anymore, right?
Yeah. So how is it changing today? I mean, before, obviously, the censorship was stronger and maybe you couldn't find out so much, but now, like you said, there's always a way. how is it changing, and how would that look like in the future? Will it eventually align with what's happening in the Western world as far as accessibility to information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know any of us who can predict what's going to happen here, you know. Because I remember in '98 when I first came in, we couldn't predict. Nobody could predict what we would be living in Beijing, for example, or many cities in China.
Yeah.
But what we read, of course, may be, you know, what's good for the consumers to understand. But I think more and more. Let me step back a minute. How do you educate 1.4 billion people into the responsibilities of freedom? You know? And I think for that, if there is this loosening and tightening of information at different stages, to allow people to kind of mature into that aspect of, you know, what does it mean to be free, you know, and to have freedoms of expression and to respect that relationship too.
With this new open door of freedom, potentially, do you see a new industry arising that has more creativity involved and expression?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking a couple of days ago to a woman a Japanese doctor, in fact, who has, I mean, very cool styles of clothing, and she goes around to a lot of the hip places in Beijing now and talks about the different styles of clothing. And, you know, I mean, down in Sanlitun and other areas, they have cool hunters. Yeah. You know, people out there with their cameras looking at the style. Cool. I mean, this used to be Western,
I like that
right?
name, cool.
Yeah. And so, you know, they're getting more and more into the fashion. The other edge of that is that's creating more and more of this thing of status, right? And, you know, we know what happens with the status and the prestige that comes along with it, the good and the bad. So that's happening here as well.
Right. And with status, I guess, comes conflict, I think. And is there any specific way that you can tell the status of somebody just by seeing them on the street, or do you have to dig a little bit deeper? Yeah,
I think you have to dig a little bit deeper. You ever heard of the human flesh search engine?
Human flesh?
Yeah. I don't know the Chinese word for it. I have to remember that. But there is an English human flesh search engine and this was a social media where they would, you know, have somebody and they'll take pictures of this guy's watches, right? Okay. And then they'd find out through the different pictures how many watches this guy has to check the social status.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this is kind of a social media watchdog.
Okay, very interesting.
And so a lot of people, because of face, they want to look really cool on the outside, but that may be all they have. You know, there's not much substance to them.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that kind of goes the same with anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But here, Chinese people, as well as Westerners, there's a point to look good, and there's a point to look higher than maybe you actually are. So it's hard to tell a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think recently, because of the changes here, a lot of the affluent have been toning down their standing out because that's becoming problematic too.
Yeah,
you know.
Very good point. One more thing, just because it's so recent, the one-child policy that is ever so famous in China has now been put to an end. Is that right? So now, I'll let you explain it, but now I guess people can make the choice on whether or not they want to have more than one child. So explain a little bit more of the concept, why it was in place before, and now that it's not in place, how would that make a difference for the future?
Yeah, I think we have to really look at it in a nuanced way, because it was in place in the 80s, but it was always dependent upon where you were. For example, if you're farmers, you could have 2 kids. If the first one was a girl and you wanted a boy, it was kind of okay. If you were a minority group, you could have more than one child. If you're in the city, then one child was pretty strict. And so that's kind of that dynamic. But then as the population aged and there's only one child, then of course you have fewer people supporting the larger retirees. So I believe next year that law will be fully enforced. However, all throughout China, there are many places that have, many people that have 2 children, especially if the first one's a girl. And it used to be, and if you look at just biology and genetics, 100 104 boys for 100 girls. Excuse me, other way around. And so now the issue here is that there are like 150 men to 100 women.
Wow.
So because of choosing and abortions, which happen a lot here, but as far as ultrasound technology, they're not supposed to tell the gender of the sex, so that way they don't discriminate.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that is illegal. But of course, you look in many cities, there's a lot of second children that are boys, and that's an issue that's going to have to be dealt with sociologically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in the future, China obviously has the biggest population in the world. I think maybe India does.
Yeah, I think India is coming really closer, and it depends on which statistics you're looking at, right?
Okay. And will that the one child policy ending, will that help China become more of a powerhouse in the future economically, or?
I've been reading debates about that because a lot of the people who are in the cities, just like in the West,
Mm-hmm.
one child is really all they want because
Mm-hmm.
it's expensive. I think it's like a lot of the me generation in the West. They say, I don't want another child.
Yeah.
One's enough.
Yeah.
So that's also one of those aspects.
Okay.
But I think a lot of the single children are feeling, the ones I've talked to, that they want to have 2 children because they know what it's like growing up being alone,
Mhm.
and they don't want to do that to their child. So, however it's going to work economically, of course, time will tell,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah, we'll have to see.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
all right. Well, before we wrap up, I always like to ask this at the end of the episode. If someone was coming to Beijing, or someone who lives in Beijing, if you could give them 3 tips, just one sentence each, what would those 3 things be?
Yeah, first one is realize that there's a phrase that's important. In Chinese, it's 没有为什么. There is no why. Because if you ask why this, why that, people say there is no why, just accept it. It makes life much simpler.
Mm.
Second, if you're here voluntarily and you don't like the pollution and you get frustrated about things, ask why you're here, right? Third, when you realize that your expectations about how culture works don't work, because the expectations here are different, life becomes pretty simple.
I love that.
So-
Keep a simple life. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Theo. Well, thanks a lot.
You bet, Sean.